materials that have much higher capacity by weight, and so you can make the anode thinner. You can have a smaller unit stack, so you can pack more energy for smaller volume. Or, for the same space, you can pack more, so you can have a longer driving range. In real life, you have to have very high yield, right?
Exactly.
If your automotive supply and your yield is, 50%, you're bankrupt. You can't survive on that. We would have multiple rounds of funding, and honestly, by now we raised over $1.3 billion. And if you would tell me this 13 years ago, it's like, hey, you have to.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Clean Techies, a podcast where we interview the leading climate tech entrepreneurs around the world, distill their lessons, and share them here for you all so that you can benefit from their experience. I'm Silas Maynard, and today I will be your host. For a written analysis and in-depth show notes, be sure to subscribe on our Substack, cleantechies.substack.com. And if you want to get the entire episode, feel free to become a paid subscriber there as well. Today, I have the opportunity to speak with Gleb Yushin, the CTO and co-founder of Sila Nanotechnologies. If you are at all familiar with the innovators in the U.S. battery industry, you will be pretty familiar with this name. Sila has developed anode technology that helps increase the density of batteries and reduce battery degradation over time, meaning you can recharge them more and more times before they kind of go kaput. So you're going to get a lot of lessons from today because they have a lot of development compared to many companies. Their batteries are in millions of devices around the world through partnerships like they have with Whoop and others. If you're not familiar with Whoop, it's kind of this band you wear. A lot of people track their sleep with it at night. So kind of a high-end device, and that's where they started, but they're moving into the EV battery space as well. So in today, you'll hear Gleb's journey and the founding story of Sila Nanotechnologies. Then you will also hear a breakdown of how their technology works and why it matters, kind of specifically in that vein of getting off of the supply chain from China's graphite specifically. And then after that, we discuss a range of macro topics, including what the silicon supply chain looks like in the US, what the process of partnering with cell manufacturers looks like and how long it takes, kind of that testing phase to make sure things are all working out all right, how their go-to-market strategy looked, what they did, and just broadly speaking, some of the lessons they learned from that. He also talks about how they built their pilot facilities and then how they are scaling up to large manufacturing facilities. I think this is extremely important for anybody else going through the pilot or scaling up phase. If you are going to do this, stick around for that part of the conversation. It's extremely valuable to hear somebody who's gone through that experience. He talks about the financing of doing that as well. And then we also talk about why the words job creation are so important. I think this is something overlooked by a lot of climate tech founders. You'll get a lot of value out of that section. And then he talks about his advice for young career professionals in the battery space, where the puck is headed in the battery industry broadly, and then a few of his favorite books. So the full conversation is about just over an hour long. To get that, you'll need to be a paid subscriber on our Substack. You can do that by going to cleantechies.substack.com/subscribe and choose any paid subscription tier, and you'll get free access or get access to the full episode. If you are not a paid subscriber, you may cash in your one-time trial to listen to this episode. I would suggest you do that for this episode. It's very, very valuable. And then if you're only a free subscriber, you will get about half of that conversation in total. Obviously, there's also ads in there for you. So enjoy this conversation with Gleb and let us know your thoughts. All right. Welcome to the podcast, Gleb. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. I'm super excited to have this. Obviously, we had to push this back. I think this is the first time I'll mention it on the pod that I just welcomed my firstborn into the world. So I'm now a dad and podcaster. So I've got a little bit more motive behind
it's amazing
this.
Journey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it definitely is. And I'm super excited for what comes of it. But we're here to talk about you. So I guess, let's start us off with telling us who is one climate tech OG or clean techie, as we like to call them, that you would love to have dinner with and why?
I think the question is like who I can learn the most from, and maybe out of all companies working on clean technologies, I would highlight First Solar. It's a company that most people don't know; they not aware of them, and they're in solar industry, and they focus typically on business to business. So they produce solar cells for utilities, and they develop their unique IP protected technology. They're scaling it up very economically, providing like tremendous values to end customers. And it's not a small feat because China's state government decided strategically that they want Chinese companies to dominate the supply chain in solar cells. So they effectively massacred through incentives, low cost capital and so forth, almost any other competitor in US and Europe. But nonetheless, First Solar survived and they prosper. They have like multi $20+ billion market
Yeah.
capitalization. They're expanding very rapidly, and they're developing their unique technology that nobody else can duplicate. And so I could probably learn a lot from the CEO of the First Solar. It's Mark Widmar.
Yeah.
I'm very bad with
You
yeah.
know, it's a really good point. I think that not a lot of people recognize the you could say the elephant in the room of people who have scaled, right? And that is one of very few companies in CleanTech 1.0, along with Tesla, that have really scaled up. And there's probably so many things to learn, especially of what not to do, right? What hiccups
That's
to
right.
avoid, right? Yeah, I followed them a little bit for my recruitment time in renewables, but
Mm.
I guess what is your personal journey into working on climate? How did you get involved in this space in the first place?
Slowly and maybe not expectedly. So I got my PhD from NC State and working on semiconductor devices, very different from CleanTech. And by the time I was graduating, I was planning to go to industry, to go to Intel, Motorola, these kind of companies. And there was a hiring freeze, so I couldn't get a single interview. But my plan B was, if this doesn't work out, to join university as a postdoctoral associate. And I was very interested in entrepreneurship. And so I thought, well, maybe I join a lab that has some technology with commercial potential and I can bring it up. And that's what I did. And, the way I approached that, I just looked into the last few years. At the time, papers published in Science or Nature, like top journals in the field, and see which ones may have some commercial potential. And then I would reach out to professors who would lead the studies and see if there is something that, if they have an opening or something. And so that's how I joined the lab of Ukrainian American professor Yuri Gogotsi at Drexel. And so that was a very exciting time. So I joined his lab and led a small team working on structured carbon materials, for electrochemical supercapacitors, for hydrogen storage for fuel cells, for biomedical applications, and so forth. And I guess like experience in his lab changed my perception of what
Mhm.
academia is. There was so much excitement, so much collaborations, positive energy in his lab. So I thought, well, actually, academia doesn't have to be boring and dry. It can be very engaging, can be almost like a startup. So I started liking that. Also, I learned a lot about clean technologies and renewables and renewable energy for transportation. And when I joined Yuri's lab, it was about the same time when Tesla was founded. So I kind of
Mhm.
followed them a little bit. And then in a few years, I kind of thought that battery powered electric vehicles make more sense than supercapacitors one or the fuel cell ones. And but people don't work on batteries or didn't work on batteries at that time. And then so we tried to license technologies from Drexel to have a startup company because we developed quite a few unique technologies, but we had troubles with this licensing agreement. And after 3 years, I thought I'll just apply to another tenure track position in other schools and develop my own technology. And I wanted to focus on batteries in particular, not on fuel cells or supercapacitors. And so that's how I ended up at Georgia Tech. And that was 2007, some time ago. And so, I focused on chemistries, the battery chemistries that theoretically were known to offer great potential, great performance enhancement, lower cost, but were known to degrade very rapidly. So, in my studies, I focused on kind of fundamentals, what causes this degradation mechanisms, how we can overcome it. And so we had like some amazing publications in the first 3 years in Science, Nature. And at that time, I thought, kind of it seems like we can overcome through nanocomposite engineering, we can overcome all these degradations, we can make it work. And then the next step would be kind of how to commercialize it. And so that
It
thing
it
eventually led to Sila.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you, from the very first moment, you said that, hey, I was thinking about finding these technologies that have been researched and then finding ways to like focus on turning them into a company of some sort. It's kind of
Mhm.
like always been in the back of your mind. I guess, where did that entrepreneurial influence come from? Where did that come from?
So I'm originally from Soviet Union, I'm from Russia. And Soviet Union had always great science, great engineering, but they kind of sucked in entrepreneurship, right? They mostly they stole the technologies in the West, try to duplicate them, and it's very frustrating. And I thought there is some magic in how to bring technologies from zero to one and scale it up and have massive impact. And I think it's the impact can be much larger compared to what you can do as a professor in the lab. You can have amazing publications, but to have a large impact, somebody has to commercialize it. Either your students or somebody else, or you can do it yourself. And so if you have all the background, all the expertise, then kind of this is something you could do it. But also I was thinking inspired. I was into art in my previous life, and there was a book about Schliemann, who was like very passionate about archaeology, and so he started different businesses, but then ended up, by his 40s with sufficient net worth, so they can focus solely on his passion. And kind of when I was very young, I thought my passion is art. So I thought, I'll do some business and then I'll do art in the end of my life. But now, over my lifetime, my perception changed. Now I'm much more passionate about entrepreneurship than about anything else, about bringing technology from scratch to the market and making an impact.
You know that feeling when you meet someone who shares your vision for the future? It just clicks, like two peas in a pod. Well, that's exactly how we felt when we met Goodwin, who we are proud to have as our sponsor.
Being the first major law firm to set up a climate-specific startup and venture practice makes them exactly the kind of partner we are excited to work with. They realize that there are a plethora of challenges to building climate tech startups, and that's why they have built an entire suite of resources for founders, investors, and entrepreneurs in the space. They even offer several tailored pricing methods. And guess what? It doesn't matter where you are listening to this. Goodwin is a global law firm that you can trust to be your partner through it all, from incorporation to exit. They've got you covered.
Go to goodwinlaw.com and tell them CleanTechie sent you to get exclusive access to startup resources. All right, back to the show.
I think it's really difficult when you're young to truly understand what motivates you. It's very difficult because there's so many conflicting kind of ideas about how you should live life and who your influences are. But at the end of the day, like, you just kind of keep working forward, and if you're willing to reflect, you eventually, settle into the way that you think is right. And who knows, maybe 10 years from now, that's not what you're supposed to do, right? Maybe something else. But I think this is always a fun part of people's challenges. I want to understand, I guess, so you explained how you got to where Sila came out of, right? But what was the, I guess, origin there at that point? Like, you saw that, you mentioned that battery degradation was a challenge, but you thought batteries were the future. So tell us a little bit more about the actual origin story of founding the company and coming up with that idea, and then how you got to where you are today.
I would say the batteries, they degrade, but they don't degrade very rapidly. Just new materials that have this new potential that can reduce the cost, improve performance, those materials degrade very rapidly. And then as soon as I realized that actually we can make it work through like rational and composite engineering, then, I was thinking about how can I make an impact. And so my initial thought, I didn't have any experience in industry or with any startup before. And so my thought was that, well, I probably can work with large company that can help me to commercialize these technologies, somebody like BASF or some other large company. And then I start talking to people in the area, is it a path to success? And they kind of changed my perception. They told me, you can have a champion in these companies, right? They can be excited about this, but this idea might take much more resources than initially envisioned, or the champion may leave, or something else may happen, or maybe the company may change priorities, and then the chances for success become smaller. While in a startup, everybody's aligned for the same goal. So both venture capitalists, founders, early employees, and all employees are aligned to make it successful, and so focused on the outcome, focused on the results. And what I wanted to do with my life is I wanted to have a high probability of the positive impact, and so that's why I wanted to focus on a startup. Without any experience, we had a Georgia Tech incubator space, and so they provided some support. But with zero experience, I didn't feel comfortable to do it successfully. So I started meeting with different people with experience in entrepreneurship, experience large executives in large companies. So I met overall with like 20 plus people. And, for me, until I met Gene, my co-founder, and I think he was way, way more special than anybody else I met before. So he had a business acumen, but he also had very good experience in engineering. I think he's a brilliant engineer. He had like 20 patents, and he was one of the earliest employees at Tesla. And so he had a lot of knowledge and experience from that. But in addition, he was special because he was very empathetic. So when somebody's so empathetic, it helps you to build trust, because it's a long journey, right? It's like almost selecting your life partner. Just you have to build trust, and you have to do it in a very short time frame. And so he had this empathy, and it was very felt very special. And then he was also had a much grander vision. So sometimes the people I met, they would be like, "Oh, where is the technology now? How long does it take to go to the next level so we can sell the company?" It's not very inspiring. And so Jin was like, "No, I want to build a company that would outlast us, maybe outlast our children, right?" And it's so much more inspiring. This is something that I would be excited to do. And so, we kind of joined forces. And so at that time, I didn't have tenure. So he moved from Silicon Valley. He moved to Atlanta and brought another co-founder, Alex Jacobs, who's, again, brilliant engineer. He helped build databases and a lot of infrastructure for the company. And then they also brought several engineers from Silicon Valley. And I attracted some of my colleagues, scientists. And so we had a very small but strong team of both scientists and engineers. And when we have scientists to overcome some scientific challenges, technical challenges, and gain deeper understanding of the processes and limitations, while engineers can help us build unique tools so that we can innovate much faster, or develop tools that can help us scale up technology when it is ready, so to have a massive impact. Because sometimes you make it work scientifically, but it's not scalable, it's too expensive, or it's too limited. So we wanted to avoid that in the first place. So we kind of, with the third co-founder, we had this vision. So we would develop a kind of materials company that would tackle challenges at the batteries with science at scale. And so hoping to bring renewables closer to life, accelerate
Yeah.
the move to renewable energy.
Climate tech founders are taking on a huge challenge. Not only do they need to know how to build a startup, but they also need to deal with hardware, have a strong handle on climate policy, know how to fundraise from diverse investor types. It's a lot.
That's why we made CleanTechies, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. In addition to our jobs, we devote 20 hours a week to producing this podcast for you. This way you can learn from the people who have walked the path before you, learn from their mistakes, and gain insights on navigating this complex journey. If this mission resonates with you, we are asking for your help. It takes a lot of effort and it's not free.
If you are already a subscriber and want to help, start supporting us today by going to Substack and clicking Upgrade to Paid. Thanks for helping all the climate tech entrepreneurs like you. It seems pretty important to that story that Gene understood a little bit about what was going on in the battery industry and could see the potential, right? And I think this is always a challenge when it comes to recruiting, especially co-founders, but just early employees in general, is there's always this like push and pull, like, hey, come work for us, but then at some point it has to stop being come work for us and they want to work with you, right? They have a really kind of, they're the one pulling. And for anybody listening who hasn't gone through that process, that's very important to recognize that kind of pull, but then eventually they should be pulling you along too. It's got to be a good relationship there. That's really helpful. And then I guess just for people who are maybe a little bit unfamiliar, just really briefly, what is the scale you guys have reached today? Where are you in your development overall?
So we have two plants. We have a plant in Alameda, California. So it's relatively small. It's equivalent of 50 megawatt hour. Next year will be about 100 megawatt hour. So small amount of materials, plenty for small wearable devices, but definitely not enough for automotive industries. And then we are final stages of building the plant in Moses Lake, so much larger, and it has several stages. So the final stage, we envisioned well over 150 gigawatt hours, so quite meaningful for electric vehicles and in many other applications. And so and we are in the final stages of first phase. First phase will be like maybe a few gigawatt hours, so still moderate, but enough for some customers.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the impact that you want to have, I always like to ask people this, like if you are able to successfully scale this to to the level of First Solar or beyond, what does the impact of your technology look like on the world?
I mean, our goal was, as I mentioned, accelerate the move to renewable energy. And so, how do we make electric vehicles more appealing, for example, right? How do we make sure they're much more efficient, they're lighter, they have faster charging time, they have longer driving range, they have a lower cost. And so, and to do that, you have to go to a very large scale. But the path is not like you have a small scale in the lab and then you build these gigantic factories, right? You have to have intermediates. And that's what we are going through.
Yeah. Okay. So let's break this down then, kind of point by point in terms of the technology. So some people may be familiar. If you are, feel free to skip ahead. But if you're not, like I was when we first started talking, what part of the battery technology are you working on?
So at the moment, the battery composes of like anode and cathode, separate in between. And so, we are focusing on the anode at the moment, and this technology we're scaling up. And so essentially, what we're bringing these new materials that have much higher capacity by weight, 6 times or more, by volume, 2-3 times more. And so you can make the anode thinner. And so it has, two advantages. On one, you can have a smaller unit stack, so you can pack more energy for smaller volume. So if you have, for example, requirements for the vehicle, say 100 kilowatt hour, whatever it is, you pack and become smaller, right? Or, for the same space, you can pack more, so you can have a longer driving range. But another advantage is that because your anode is thinner, you can charge it much faster. So the charging time is kind of roughly proportional to the square of the thickness of the electrode. So if you make the anode thinner, you can charge much faster. So you can increase charging time by 2-3 times or more. And so, and that's what we're focusing on. But in the longer term, we do plan to innovate in multiple areas.
Of course.
Innovative, more revolutionary technologies.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. So, and then in terms of the anode itself, what is typically used, and then to what extent you're able to kind of explain very simply what are you using in replacement of that?
Yeah, for sure. So typically people use graphite. All of those are well known. This is almost initial chemistry that people introduced like 3 decades ago when they introduced lithium-ion batteries. It hasn't changed that much since that time. And so you have, when lithium intercalates into graphite, intercalation means it finds some interstitial positions within the crystal structure of graphite and put lithium in. And typically you need, 6 carbon atoms to store 1 lithium. And so what we are working with is silicon chemistry. And so with silicon, you need like 1 silicon atom to host 4 lithium atoms. And so it sounds exciting, right? You can have much smaller weight, smaller volume. The challenge is that when you lithiate silicon, it expands a lot. And so this expansion can cause all sorts of issues, electrochemical, chemical, mechanical. And so with nanocomposite engineering, we overcome these challenges. And so another challenge with graphite, not fundamental challenge, but the way it is kind of dealt with nowadays, is that there is significant push to reduce cost. And so, most of the graphite production is controlled by one country, China.
Yeah.
So, you lose control over the, environment when the graphite is being mined, right? You can consume a lot of energy. This energy might not be renewable. You often pollute everything around yourself, right? You consume a lot of CO2, so they emit a lot of CO2, not consume. You emit a lot of CO2, and so we kind of we're replacing this technology with something much more efficient, much more effective, but that kind of relies on engineering.
Yeah.
And so instead of kind of escalation of the natural materials.
So then, obviously people would probably comment, hey, maybe the you could say the counter argument is, hey, it's too expensive to use this because it requires engineering versus, graphite is a little bit less, I guess you could say, process intensive. So is there any reason to believe that you can't reach cost parity with the way graphite's produced in terms of, the actual capacity you can produce?
So that's a good question, but the answer is absolutely. So if you rely on natural resources and you know that your demand is going to go up, your cost is not going to go down. Typically goes up, right? So you have high demand for metals as nickel, cobalt, the price goes up, right? You can't control it. But engineering, with time and with scale, the cost always goes down, right?
Yeah.
If you think about the cost of a chip, 30 years ago was much more expensive, right?
Yeah.
So with engineering, you can drive down the cost, and when you rely on natural resources, you cannot. And then if you think about it, silicon is one of the most abundant elements on Earth's crust. It's actually as abundant as all other metals, semi-metals combined. So you don't have kind of supply chain issues. You can, use silicon everywhere. And then, the capacity of silicon is, pure silicon is roughly 10 times higher. So you can have this abundant material that is, cheap in the raw state, right? That has 10 times higher capacity compared to graphite. So, for the same, if you excavate it, actually it's more abundant, so it should be cheaper in the raw state. So yes, you do this engineering, you do this processing, which is at the moment more expensive than graphite, but over time it can be cheaper, right?
Yeah.
And you have then this advantage because you have high capacity, so you don't need to produce as much. And then you don't need to process, you don't need to ship it back and forth. You don't need to rely on a few large factories to produce it. And you can have very clean technology that is kind of localized, one maybe in Europe, one in North America, one in Asia, that will be clean, efficient, and with scale, the cost is going to go down.
So in terms of bringing the cost down, you mentioned obviously engineering challenge, but how much of the supply chain is already built out for silicon in the US specifically?
So supply chain, maybe just broadly speaking, in batteries is in their stage. Majority of anode materials are graphite, right? So
Yeah.
95% of graphite is controlled by China. Almost 100% of the base film for separators also controlled by China. Majority of cathode
Mm.
supply chain is controlled by China. So in the US, supply chain is kind of small, not necessarily non-existing, but very small. And so we developed this new technologies that kind of changes category, basically introduces the category shift. Moving away from graphite to silicon is a category shift. Doesn't happen very often. And we were the first to innovate and develop this technology at Sila, and now we are scaling it up. So we hope to this, not only be very good in innovation, but also very good in manufacturing, and so we can produce enough materials to secure a supply chain for our customers.
Yeah. Got it. And then just to clarify though, is there already some because silicon is used for many different things in my understanding. So is there some level of supply chain of silicon production that would feed into your supply chain that's kind of already somewhat built out in the US?
Materials for us, yes. So
Yeah.
we rely
Yeah.
on silane gas, and we secure with long-term supply agreement with the
Yeah.
US producer of silane gas. So yeah, the technology of this gas production is pretty straightforward. It's pretty old, so it's a matter of investment of capital and
Yeah.
building facilities, and
Yeah.
so the cost can be quite small at large scale.
Got it. So I'm going to try to recap a couple things here just to make sure people understand this. So the technology itself, you're creating a different type of anode to use to replace graphite, kind of for a few different reasons. Mainly, it has better density, so you can charge it more times, or you can fit more in it for a smaller space, right? Which is helpful for lightweight applications or for packing more range into an EV, for example. Everybody wants a 500-mile, 600-mile EV,
Yeah.
even though gas cars only usually get 400. I don't always understand the complaint there, but so that's one piece. This also would allow for kind of getting off of the supply chain issues that we have with China, for example. And then in terms of your technology, what you guys are aiming to produce is strictly the anode materials, which then currently at least could be sold to other battery cell producers. You're not aiming to produce your own cells, at least not yet, correct?
That's right. That's right. We
Yeah.
don't do it.
So you can just kind of plug into the existing supply chain. Let's talk slightly about that. Make sure I've got all that right before
Yeah,
we move on. Okay.
perfectly.
So if you are selling, materials to a different type of materials to a battery cell manufacturer, how does it look like for them? I understand that you guys have to send samples probably to get these things tested, but how does it look like to integrate with these other cell producers? And are they open to that, or are they pretty skeptical? How does that look?
Well, that's a good question. So our technology is drop-in compatible, so they don't need to change equipment how they integrate our technology in their facilities. In the meantime, some cell makers are excited about it. Others are kind of, they are more excited about mass market, and mass market is still graphite, and so they would want to just produce as many cells as they can for the time being. And so, but what happens is that not end users, but the OEMs, so the car makers or the device makers, they're excited about this technology because it can help them to differentiate from the competitors, also increase overall appeal of their vehicles or devices. So they kind of push in that. So, what happens often, not always, but what happens often is that, we work with the car makers or device makers. They're excited about our technology. And then they say, hey, we really want to work with the company ABC for the cell development. So then we have to have a kind of joint agreement between three of us, so we can integrate our technology in cells, and then the cells are going to be powering new devices or new cars. And so, but it still requires a lot of back and forth. So they still need to adopt, change the recipe, right? Even honestly, if you change the graphite from one supplier to another supplier, you still need to change the recipe. Or the mixing recipe, the slurries, the viscosity, everything changes. And so they have to have this recipe change. And then what we, maybe in contrast to many other companies do, we provide a lot of engineering support. So we provide kind of notes, how the best use our materials, what is the best co-products that we found work really well with our materials. And we kind of help them every step of the way. So if they have challenges, it's important to communicate it very quickly, so we can help them to understand what happened, so the likely cause, so we can move on. And the key is like to have very short iteration cycles, so we can discuss the results, if there is a challenge, how to overcome and do experiments, confirm it, and move on. And so, but overall, I think, especially in cars, the requirements are very severe, right? So the car needs to survive for like 15 years, right? If you buy a car, you pay a lot of money, you don't want to replace it every 5 years or 10 years. You want to last quite significant amount of time. And so there are multiple tests, right? that service life has to be long, so you have to do high temperature storage tests, you have to do cycle life tests under different conditions, different temperatures. You need to ensure that the stacks and the batteries are safe, that the battery pack is also safe, the models are safe. So a lot of testing, and so sometimes you change something, you have to kind of overcome new challenges that you're not aware of, and that's why this building trust, building very close collaboration, and understanding, for us to understand batteries really well is very important for successful technology adoption. We want to make sure that our partners are excited to work with us, right? That we provide all the needed support for them to kind of smoothen and simplify their journey.
Yeah, it sounds like so. It's to some extent, this is not exactly a massive change because if they, as you mentioned, if they change supplier, even then they still have to make sure they do a few
That's
kind of
right.
test runs to make sure it works. And what you're proposing is that effectively they can keep running on the same exact equipment. So it's not like they have to upgrade their equipment of any sort.
That's right.
That's kind of baked into it. And if they decided to stop using you, they could continue using a graphite style cell production, right?
Yep.
So let's back up a little bit. You already alluded to this. I want to kind of shift into, I guess you could say, go to market generally a little bit. So you mentioned earlier you worked on with some small device companies kind of for your specialty, let's call it specialty production at a lower scale.
Mhm.
Can you just talk to people about the importance of identifying that kind of, let's say, specialty market that will pay more for a battery when you haven't reached that cost reduction piece yet, and then how you kind of parlay that into going up to the big leagues with EVs?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Silas. I think so. If you just focus on electric vehicle markets, right, you want to have this very large impact. They only want to talk to you if you can produce this gigantic amount of material, right? And then you have to satisfy all these crazy requirements. But before you build this gigantic factory, you have to build a factory which is smaller, right? And to de-risk technology to make sure that it works on maybe smaller scale. And so we go with smaller volumes, the cost is going to be higher. So then you have to have technologies that would benefit from your technology, or devices that benefit from your technologies at more, that would be more cost forgiving. And so in battery materials, it's a very nice system that the batteries can help lots of devices, can help small wearables, can help large wearable devices, and then eventually can help cars. And so you're moving from milligrams of material per device to grams, to tens of grams, to then kilograms, to then tens of kilograms. And then as you move through those kind of different scales, you over time typically make materials better and better and better, so they can satisfy more stringent requirements. And so that worked really well for us. We are in the market in millions of devices by now, so for 3 years. And so we learned that technology really works really well. We have no incidents, we have no safety issues, we have no premature kind of death issues, and that brings additional confidence to our customers in other spaces, right? And so it kind of in our eyes, we don't want to be delusional, right? We want to make sure technology really works, not what we think it works, but to have a confirmation that it works. And so we do all these tests for the in automotive batteries, right? And very, very comprehensive tests requiring lots of materials, a lot of time, a lot of money. But we also want to make sure that there is no fundamental flaws that we overlooked by accident. And so having devices in the market for a long time is very special.
Yeah.
It gives you additional
No.
comfort.
Yeah, that definitely the proof in the pudding, right? Show up to a demo if it's just a whiteboard. It's not the same as showing them a physical product, right?
If you can have a PowerPoint, right? I don't know, is it like with all devices that you tested, or with you selected 3 out of 100 devices you tested?
Yeah,
Because in real life, you have to have very high yield, right?
exactly.
If you're automotive supply and your yield is, I don't know, 50%, you're bankrupt. You can't survive on that. And
Yeah,
so you have to have you have to be in millions of devices to prove that yes, your technology is real.
this is the hard part. I think a lot of hardware or deep tech founders, I guess you could say, in climate are facing is obviously it is a long time horizon. I think you guys have been at this 13 years now or 10 years roughly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well,
I mean,
eventually,
like,
so we were in Georgia Tech Incubator for first
yeah,
3 years,
yeah.
pretty small team. So if you don't count that, then only a decade.
Yeah, yeah. So still, I mean, still a long time, right? And certainly something that a lot of VCs would be like, hey, when are you guys gonna, IPO or sell or something, right? So, there's certainly some challenges there, but I think it's just important for people to be realistic about it. And you have to have that kind of proof in the market before you move on. So let's talk about this. in the scale up journey, the manufacturing process, right? If you're manufacturing a material that's used in other company, in other, like in batteries in this case, how did you start initially? So I'm sure you had some lab space for the beginning, but once you needed to produce a handful of, samples for a client, who did you work with, and then what are the steps that you took from there to get to the point where I believe you guys not that long ago announced your big plant in Georgia, right?
No, Moses Lake in Washington.
Most Washington. Okay.
So we historically were developing our own equipment and making our samples. So initially Georgia Tech incubator, but obviously it's very small amount of samples. But because we had small amount of samples, we developed very unique cell technologies. We made very small but very precise batteries that would tell about performance of the materials quite precisely. At least not everything, but most of the parameters were precisely controlled on a cell level. So we can predict, okay, we have performance of this tiny cell, but because it's so well controlled, so well engineered, that we can know that when we send materials to our customers, they're going to have similar performance in larger devices. And then when we moved to California, to Alameda from Atlanta, Georgia, we kept the same philosophy. So we would design our own equipment and we would produce our own materials. And that's why we built pilot scale production 5 years ago. And we are still supplying materials for small wearable devices from these facilities in Alameda. But then when you go to larger scale, what you also realize is that you cannot build your own equipment at scale. You need to rely on partners who have been building this equipment for a very long time. And so our issue was initially just kind of trust issues, because we didn't want somebody else making equipment and then selling it to our competitors, selling to China, somebody else. And so what happened was that we developed exclusive relationship. And so we have different equipment pieces. And so we buy these pieces of equipment from different companies and we integrate it ourselves. We develop our own software to run the tools, to do all the magic. And I think it works quite well because, we are all have the same incentives. They're interested in our success. We are interested in our success. And so we plan to work with these partners at much larger scale.
So let me get that right. So you're saying that initially you guys built your own equipment mainly from an IP perspective. You said, hey, we want to control this. I'm assuming like a side note with that would be you had more control over quicker iteration rather than using a contract manufacturer. Is
That's
that
right.
also accurate?
You're right. Actually, I didn't mention that, but Silas, you got a very good point. So not only we could, iterate much faster, we also at the very early stage, and which is unusual for companies, we use a lot of automation. So we built robots to make materials, and so we can synthesize 10 samples in 24 hours
Yeah.
without human interaction. So it improved precision of the kind of control, but also improved how much materials we can produce. We couldn't produce a lot in each run, but we can produce enough to do evaluation
Yeah.
because we had small cells.
And then, so continuing on that thread, after we needed to get to a larger scale, you said we can't build all of the equipment ourselves, but let's figure out, what are the baseline components that we can kind of compile from other people and maybe, sprinkle in a little bit of our own special sauce. That way, it's not just like a wholesale out there on the market. Somebody else is going to take it and produce it, because in a way, the equipment itself is the IP because it's producing an output, like a chemical.
Yeah, that's right. The equipment is IP. We typically keep it as a know-how, or sometimes we do have a patents on equipment design.
Mm-hmm.
But in US you can do non-publication patents. So we have tons of patents that we never published. But so we would, because when you publish the patent, you have to tell the world how you do it. And so there are some parts of the world where the IP is not very respected. So I kind of don't want them to copy it.
Yeah.
And so, but we want to have this kind of fleet of we call submarine patents. Patents
Yeah.
that are never published, in case we need them, in case somebody
Mm-hmm.
is attacking us, or we have to protect our own IP. But typically, the most historical way to do it is know-hows, because in many cases, what equipment you use to produce the material, it determines, the quality, determines the performance, but it's very hard to prove that you use exactly the same equipment or exactly the same process. Like
Mm-hmm.
I can, for example, open the cell and say, oops, it's copycat materials because it infringes on hundreds of our patents, but I cannot tell, with 100% certainty. I can be convinced myself, but it's very hard to convince everybody else that they used exactly the same processes or exactly
Yeah.
exactly the same design. So
Yeah.
it's much harder, and I cannot go to China and say, hey, can you open your factories and I'll inspect it and see if you
Yeah.
engine my IP.
Yeah.
It's not realistic.
It's not realistic. Yeah. So, okay. So then you built this kind of pilot facilities. What was the first kind of larger scale production that were you just producing it all from your pilot facilities for those small wearables, or did you build
So
another facility? And my question is two pointed here is, what did it look like and how did you fund it? Did you have like proof from other people saying, hey, we've got this correct and we know that we can scale to this level. So give us a debt facility so that we don't have to do it all in equity. Like, can you just explain that part as well? All right, everybody, thanks for sticking around this long. This is the end of the free version of this episode. The remainder of this episode has a lot of meat in it, specifically how they built their pilot projects and how they are building their first commercial scale facility. This doesn't include also the tips and tricks of how they funded it, a key component if you're going to do that. And a lot of founders are kind of approaching that phase, so I'd recommend checking that out. There is a section on how to get funding from the government as well. He talks about why the words job creation matter so much when you're building a climate tech startup. He also gives some career advice to young folks in the battery space, and then the overall trends of the battery sector. He shares a couple pointers there. Shares as well some startup ideas for the battery space. And then, of course, we wrap up with some of his favorite books. So if you'd like to get the full version, you can use your one-time trial of the CleanTechie's paid subscription to get access to it. If you've already used that trial or are interested in getting all future content and having no restrictions on how much you listen, become a paid subscriber today by going to cleantechies.substack.com/subscribe and choosing any paid tier. By becoming a paid member, you will also get access to our insiders WhatsApp chat, where we often discuss topics like what they thought about the podcast themselves. We solicit questions for upcoming guests and much more. So a little bit of an insiders kind of chat there. If you'd like to get this and many other perks of being a paid subscriber, become one today. And we hope to see you on the other side. If not, we'll see you next time on the free version. Take care.